On the 18th of January, 1919, in a quiet farmhouse on the vast Sandringham estate, a 13-year-old boy drew his last breath. His death was not from the Spanish flu that was ravaging the globe, nor was it a casualty of the Great War that had just ended. He died in his bed during a violent, shuddering fit that his body could no longer endure. The boy's name was Prince John Charles Francis, the fifth son and youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary of England. He was sixth in line to the most powerful throne in the world, and yet his death was announced with a stark, chilling brevity. The court circular, a mere 2 sentences, noted his passing with an almost administrative coldness. His funeral was a small private affair, attended by family and the estate staff who knew him. There was no grand procession through London, no public outpouring of grief for a lost prince. Because for most of the public he was already lost. He had been made to disappear years earlier. This is the story of that disappearance. It's a story that the House of Windsor tried to bury for nearly a century, a tale of a boy deemed unfit for the public eye. A prince whose existence became an inconvenience to the crown. What really happened to Britain's tragic Prince John? Was he the victim of a cold, image-obsessed family, a callous dynasty that discarded its own imperfect child? Or is the truth more complicated, a tragedy born not of malice, but of fear, ignorance, and a desperate, misguided form of love in an unforgiving era? To find the answer, we must strip away the veneer of royalty and look into the heart of a secret kept locked away in a gilded cage. Your story begins not with his death, but with his birth on the 12th of July, 1905. He was Johnny, the beloved baby of the family. In early photographs, he is a cherubic, happy-looking child, nestled in the arms of his mother or surrounded by his 5 older siblings: Edward, the future king who would abdicate for love; Bertie, the reluctant future king George VI; Mary, the Princess Royal Henry, Duke of Gloucester; and George, Duke of Kent. In these early years, Johnny was an integral part of the family portrait, a symbol of the monarchy's fertile continuation. His father, the future George V, was a stern man, a naval officer by training who believed in discipline and duty above all else. He famously said he was afraid of his mother, Queen Victoria. His children were afraid of him, and he was damned well going to see to it that his grandchildren were afraid of him too. His mother, Mary of Teck, was queen consort, a woman known for her icy public demeanor and an almost fanatical devotion to the protocols of royalty. Yet, letters and diaries reveal a more complex woman, one who could be warm and loving in private, though often constrained by the rigid expectations of her role. For the first 4 years of his life, Johnny was, by all accounts, a bright, precocious, and charmingly mischievous child. He was described as winsome and painfully funny. He was just another royal child, learning his letters, playing in the vast gardens of Sandringham, and being groomed for a life of quiet privilege, if not direct rule. But everything changed on a summer's day in 1909. The royal family was gathered at Sandringham. 4-year-old Johnny was playing, when suddenly, without warning, he collapsed. His small body went rigid, then began to convulse uncontrollably. It was his first epileptic seizure. To his family, and to the royal physicians who rushed to his side, this was more than a medical emergency. It was a catastrophe of dynastic proportions. In Edwardian England, epilepsy was a deeply misunderstood and feared condition. It was known as the falling sickness, a disorder shrouded in stigma and superstition. It was viewed not merely as a neurological illness, but as a sign of mental deficiency, of tainted blood, of hereditary madness. For the royal family, whose entire claim to power rested on the purity of their lineage and their divine right to rule, a child with epilepsy was a terrifying prospect. It was a blemish on the carefully constructed image of a flawless, powerful dynasty. The timing was also horrific. The early 20th century was the dawn of the eugenics movement, a pseudo-scientific ideology that promoted the idea of improving the human race through selective breeding. The unfit, the feeble-minded, and those with hereditary illnesses were increasingly seen as a threat to the nation's health and strength. A prince with a chronic, incurable neurological disorder was, in the cold calculus of the era, a liability of the highest order. The diagnosis confirmed their worst fears. Prince John had epilepsy. From that moment on, a subtle but deliberate process of erasure began. The first step was to control the information. The illness was a closely guarded secret. The public, and indeed much of the extended royal court, was not to know. The second step was to begin his withdrawal from the world that was his birthright. He began to appear less and less at public family gatherings. While his siblings were paraded before the cameras, Johnny was kept in the background, out of sight. The coronation of his father, King George V, in 1911 was a seminal event for the nation and the empire. His older siblings played prominent roles, visible to the world. Prince John, then nearly 6 years old, was deemed unfit to attend. He was not present to see his own father crowned king, emperor. It was a stark, public declaration, made through his absence, that he was different. He was not one of them, not anymore. As he grew, his condition did not improve. The seizures continued, unpredictable and frightening. Alongside the epilepsy, he began to show signs of what today would likely be diagnosed as a learning disability or a form of autism. He was often repetitive in his actions and required special instruction. Yet, those who knew him well spoke of his unique charm and his own particular way of seeing the world. He was known for his witty, often impertinent, remarks that would cut through the stiff formality of the court. On one occasion, when his famously severe grandmother, Queen Alexandra, asked him about a dead mole he was holding, he supposedly retorted, "I'm going to give it to Grandmama for her collection." Another story tells of him deliberately pushing his grandmother's wheelchair into a patch of stinging nettles. These weren't acts of malice, but of a boy who didn't understand or conform to the rigid social codes that governed his family's every move. He was an uncontainable spirit in a world that demanded absolute containment, but the monarchy had no room for such a spirit. The image was everything. And so, in 1916, at the height of the First World War, the final decision was made. Prince John, now 11 years old, was to be permanently removed from the family home. He was sent to live at Wood Farm, a secluded farmhouse on the sprawling Sandringham estate in Norfolk. It was a move cloaked in the language of care. The official line, had one ever been given, would have been that he needed the quiet country air, a peaceful environment away from the stresses of London and the court. But the reality was undeniable. He was being sent into exile. Wood Farm was a comfortable home, but it was a prison nonetheless, a gilded cage where the forgotten prince could live out his days without embarrassing the crown. This is the crucial point in the story, the moment that defines the tragedy of Prince John. Was this an act of monstrous cruelty? Did his parents, the king and queen, simply cast their damaged son aside to protect their reputation? It's the easiest conclusion to draw, and the one that casts the monarchy in the darkest light. A family so obsessed with power and image that it would sacrifice its own child. But the truth, buried in the letters and diaries of those involved, is far more complex and, in some ways, even more heartbreaking. It's a story not just of royal duty, but of parental agony in an era that offered no good solutions. To understand their decision, we have to understand the world they lived in. The pressure on George V and Queen Mary was immense. The First World War was raging, and monarchies were collapsing all across Europe. Their own cousins, the Romanovs in Russia, would soon be brutally executed. The British monarchy's survival depended on projecting an image of unshakable strength, stability, and perfection. A publicly known epileptic prince, seen as defective, could have been used as propaganda by anti-monarchists, presented as proof of the royal family's degenerate bloodline. Their fear was not just for their image, but for the very institution of the monarchy itself. Furthermore, the medical advice they received would have been terrifying. Doctors of the day might have warned them that John's condition was not only incurable, but would likely lead to insanity and a premature death. They might have been advised that his presence would be a source of distress and danger to his siblings and the household. Segregation of epileptics into farm colonies and asylums was common practice, seen as a humane solution for both the patient and society. In their minds, sending John to Wood Farm might have been a desperate attempt to give him the best possible life under circumstances they saw as impossible. They were giving him his own private, protected world, shielded from a public that would have been cruel and uncomprehending. But a protected world is still a world of isolation. At Wood Farm, Johnny's universe shrank to the farmhouse, its gardens and the surrounding woods. His primary companion was not his mother or father, but his governess, Charlotte Bill, known affectionately as Lala. Lala Bill was the one constant in Johnny's life. She had been his nurse since infancy, and when he was sent into exile, she went with him without a second thought. She was his teacher, his caregiver, his fiercest protector, and for all intents and purposes his mother. It was Lala who managed his medication, who comforted him after a seizure, who taught him to read and write, and who understood his unique personality. Her devotion was absolute. She created a routine for him, a life with its own simple joys. Johnny had his own garden, which he tended with great pride. It was his small patch of earth, a place where he had control. He was allowed to play with the local children from the estate, something unheard of for a royal prince. For the first time in his life, he had something resembling a normal childhood friendship. His mother, Queen Mary, even arranged for a local girl named Winifred Thomas, who also suffered from epilepsy, to be brought to Wood Farm as a companion for him. It was a gesture of profound empathy, an attempt to ease her son's loneliness, by giving him a friend who could truly understand what he was going through. These glimmers of kindness and consideration complicate the narrative of a heartless family. They visited him. Queen Mary would often drive over from the main house at Sandringham to spend time with her youngest son, to read to him, to watch him play. In her diary, she documented these visits, noting his happiness and his health with the meticulous detail of a concerned parent. King George V, though more distant, also visited. He was a man who struggled to show affection to any of his children, but he made the effort for Johnny. Yet the isolation was profound. While his brothers were serving in the military, and his sister was being presented at court, Johnny's world was circumscribed by the farm's fences. He was a prince who would never wear a uniform, never attend a state banquet, never undertake a royal duty. He was a secret. His name was rarely mentioned outside the immediate family. The British public, caught up in the horrors of the war, largely forgot that the king and queen even had a sixth child. He had been effectively, silently, edited out of the national story. What did Johnny himself understand of his situation? It's impossible to know for sure. Did he feel the sting of his exclusion? Did he miss his siblings? Did he wonder why he couldn't live in the grand palaces he had been born in? Perhaps, but the accounts from Lala Bill and others suggest a child who was, in many ways, content in his small world. He was free from the oppressive formality and rigid scrutiny of court life. A life that his brother Bertie, the future George Vi, found torturous. At Wood Farm, Johnny could be himself. He could be loud, he could be funny, he could get his hands dirty in the garden. He could be a boy, not a prince. One could argue that in trying to hide him, his family accidentally gave him the one thing a royal child can never have, a semblance of a normal life. But the shadow of his illness was always there. As he entered his teenage years, the seizures became more frequent and more severe. His health began to visibly decline. Lala Bill's letters from this period are filled with anxiety. She watched the boy she adored being ravaged by an illness. No one could stop. The end, when it came, was sudden. On the afternoon of the 18th of January, 1919, Johnny suffered what was described as a severe seizure. Lala was with him. She held him. And then it was over. The restless soul, as his mother would later write, was finally at peace. He was 13 years old. The news was sent by telephone to Queen Mary and King George at Buckingham Palace. The Queen's diary entry from that day is one of the most debated and analysed documents in this story. She wrote, "Lala telephoned from Wood Farm that our poor darling Johnny had passed away suddenly after one of his attacks. The news was a great shock. For the poor little boy's restless soul, death came as a great release. I broke the news to George and we motored down to Wood Farm, found poor Lala very resigned, but heartbroken. Johnny looked very peaceful lying there." The key phrase, of course, is, "a great release." To modern ears it sounds shockingly cold, a mother expressing relief at her son's death. But again, context is everything. She wasn't relieved for herself, she was relieved for him. For years, she had watched her son suffer, watched his body betray him, watched him live in the shadow of an ever-present threat. For her, his death was an end to his pain. It was a mother's expression of grief for a life lived in torment. Later, she would write to a friend, "For him, it is a great release, as his malady was becoming worse as he grew older, and he has thus been spared much suffering. I cannot say how grateful we feel to God for having taken him in such a peaceful way. It is a great blow to us, but God's will be done." The family's grief seems genuine. His brother, Prince Edward, the future Edward VA, who was often portrayed as flippant and callous, wrote movingly about Johnny's death. He described him as a family beast of burden in a way and said, "His death was the greatest relief imaginable, or what we've always silently prayed for. Again, the word relief is jarring, but he continued. He was more of an animal than anything else. This poor boy had become more of a pain than a pleasure to the family. This sounds brutal, but it speaks to the helplessness and the horror the family felt watching Johnny's decline. They loved him, but they were also repulsed and terrified by his illness. Edward also wrote, "I've known little of him of late years," a sad admission of the success of Johnny's isolation. He recalled his younger brother fondly, as a witty and unique child, and his letter is tinged with a deep, sorrowful regret. He sent Lala Bill a photograph of himself, a gesture of solidarity with the woman who had been a mother to his brother when the Queen could not. Johnny was buried in the churchyard of St. Mary Magdalene on the Sandringham estate, the same church the royal family attends for Christmas services to this day. It was a private ceremony. His grave is simple, marked by a plain stone cross. For decades, that was the end of the story. Prince John faded from memory, a footnote in the royal lineage. He was absent from family trees, his photographs locked away in the royal archives. He was the prince who never was. So what is the final verdict? What really happened to Prince John? The story resists a simple answer. It was not a straightforward case of cruelty, of a family callously discarding an unwanted child. The evidence of their private grief, of Queen Mary's attempts to create a comfortable life for him, of Lala Bill's unwavering devotion, paints a much more nuanced picture. But it is also not a story without blame. The decision to erase him, to hide him away, was born of fear. Fear for the monarchy's image, fear of public opinion, fear of a misunderstood illness. They chose the institution over the individual. They prioritized the stability of the crown over the inclusion of their own son. They loved him, but they loved the monarchy more. In their attempt to protect him from the world, and the world from him, they condemned him to a life of profound loneliness, and denied him his place in his own family and in history. For most of the 20th century, the silence held. He was the ghost in the Windsor family machine. Then, in the late 1990s, things began to change. The Royal Archives began to open up previously unseen documents and photographs. In 1998, a Channel 4 documentary, The Lost Prince, first brought his story to a wider audience. It was followed in 2003 by a critically acclaimed drama of the same name by writer-director Stephen Polyakov, which used the family's own letters and diaries to reconstruct Johnny's life. Suddenly, the forgotten prince was front-page news. The public was captivated and horrified by the story of the boy who had been hidden away. His grave at Sandringham, once overlooked, became a site of pilgrimage. People left flowers and toys for the prince the world was never meant to know. The rediscovery of Prince John's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our reverence for institutions and our historical treatment of disability. His tragedy highlights the immense pressure placed upon a single family and the brutal choices they felt they had to make to survive. It reveals the human cost of the crown, the sacrifices made in the name of duty and tradition. Queen Elizabeth II, Johnny's niece, reportedly kept a photograph of her forgotten uncle on her desk. A small, private acknowledgement of the boy, who was her family's secret sorrow. In the end, Prince John's story is not just about a forgotten prince. It's about a family caught between love and duty, between compassion and fear. It is the story of Lala Bill, a woman whose quiet, steadfast love was the one true crown Johnny ever knew. And it is the story of a boy, witty and charming, who was born into the most visible family on earth, only to be rendered invisible. His life was short, his suffering was immense. But in his rediscovery, he has achieved something that was denied to him in life. He is remembered. The secret is out. The silence is broken, and the tragic forgotten prince has finally taken his place in the story, not as a blemish or a liability, but as a human being whose life, and whose loss, has something profound to teach us all about the true meaning of value, acceptance, and the high price of a perfect image.